Marshall, when I was reading your book, talking about this idea of coming out into your garden and being ready to weed and plant things and make the garden kind of bend to your will, and then having to pause and maybe listen to the rhythms of your garden. Can you tell us a little bit about this? Because I think we often do that a bit with our grief, don't we? We go, I'm going to grieve the best. I'm going to grieve in this way and I'm going to complete it and I can finish it. But actually, like, life doesn't work with that. We have to go with the rhythms. So maybe you can talk a little bit about your experience of that.
Yeah, it really doesn't. And I think that's one of the things about grief, actually, that we find so difficult. We live in a time and in a society that kind of conditions us to believe that we have control or that we should have control, really. A lot about our life is about dictating control over things. Um, and that's unnatural. That idea in and of itself is pretty unnatural. And grief is one of those particularly one of those states in which we don't have any control over the way in which we grieve, and it can often take us by surprise, and catches us out at moments unawares, and really reminds us, I think, of the way in which the cycles of the natural world really do operate. They ebb and they flow, and things spiral through time. And this spiral is a pattern that I kind of work with it, that I was thinking about a lot in the writing of my book, and about the way in which, when we have not when we turn away from addressing traumas and losses in our life, when we kind of repress them, um, ignore them, just kind of try to push them away and move on, whatever that kind of means, that actually we end up stuck with them. The kind of psychoanalytic jargon is, repetition compulsion. We end up being compelled to repeat those patterns over and over again until we do find a way of kind of facing them and addressing them and accepting them and allowing them to kind of integrate into ourselves kind of more fully. And then reconnecting with the rest of the natural world. Because there's a way in which we kind of use language to kind of, as if we and nature are two kind of separate and different things, when actually that's not true. We're a really kind of integral part of nature. We are nature, and nature is us. And when we bring ourselves back into closer relationship with the rest of the natural world and can be reminded of how these cycles work and of how we work in these cyclical ways, there is something deeply soothing and comforting about that, because it's just more essentially true to our kind of being. And I think one of the things about nature that can be so helpful is its capacity to allow us to explore these darker feelings, more difficult feelings, more painful parts of ourselves that in general we don't tend to be very well schooled in how to cope and how to deal with and how to navigate them. You talked about people not having the words. We're not we don't know how to have the words for bad feelings, because we're taught that they're bad and that we must then just kind of push them away and move on from them as quickly as possible. And actually, pain is an incredible signal from our body. An acute pain is a signal asking, from our body, our mind, our kind of spirit, asking us to turn towards the pain so that we can understand the source of it, make sense of it, and thereby heal it. When we kind of turn away from it and push away from it, we're doing really the opposite of what the pain is asking us to do, of why the pain is there. And certainly in terms of gardening, I mean, I do love swimming, but it's not what my particular book was about. But water is a theme that I think about a lot in other ways, and I think there might be another book for me with that kind of theme. But for me, the one that really called to me for this book was about land, coming into relationship with land. And as I wrote the book, I realized that was very much based in a kind of old generational trauma of being stripped away from land, or being put into very controlling, dominated relationships with land that weren't of their choosing. So I'm thinking of ancestors of mine who were taken to the Caribbean to be enslaved people working on plantations. That my heritage is very mixed. So that's not my only ancestry, but I think that trauma formed a really important part of my story, of the story that I believed about who I was and my kind of relationship with place. And so turning to land and coming back into relationship with land was, I think, a really necessary way for me to work through those kind of more painful and more difficult feelings. And the wonderful thing about the cycles of nature, I'm looking at my garden now, and we're in autumn. It's coming into a phase that I find really difficult when things start dying back and they start looking really quite kind of shabby, and the garden isn't in the full lushness of life and growth. But I know that actually, I know now through listening to the garden, through spending time in it and being with it and developing a communication with the garden, none of which is based in words, but so little of our ability to communicate is based in words. Less than 10% of even interhuman communication is about language, is about the words that we use. The vast majority of our communication we pick up from how other people, what they're feeling, what they're thinking, what's on their mind, and communicate ourselves completely wordlessly. So we can do that as well, and I think we do that as well with place, with the kind of natural world around us. When we spend time in places and when we begin to develop a relationship with places, we learn how the place feels. And I think it learns that about us as well. There's this reciprocity of relationship. And the garden, the kind of nature, the natural world, when it enters into those darker parts of its cycles, those kind of more difficult bits, the dying back, the wintering, the stormy seas, those parts that we can't maybe throw ourselves into, with that, they don't bring us joy and uplift necessarily to be in relationship with those. It allows us to manage those more difficult feelings, and it gives us a template for seeing how more difficult times can be managed. Now the garden dies back, but all of that dead growth will be composted, and it becomes the very fuel of the life that will come in spring, of the bit that I find enjoyable. And it's a really interesting thing, when we do, as we are so often tempted to do in our kind of modern way, when you numb or suppress or repress in away from painful feelings, actually we can't numb any feeling in isolation. So when we numb pain, we also numb our ability to feel joy and to feel bliss and transcendence and love and all of those things that keep us going, all of the things that make life worth living. So actually we need to be able to feel all of those feelings really as fully as possible. And I think seeing how the rest of the world around us navigates these cycles of light and dark gives us a template for how we can do that ourselves, but also reminds us that these things are cyclical and that lighter times will come. They do come. So yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why the natural world is so important really in this.